Today I'd like to talk about hell. This concept is well known in our culture, and it's so known you may have noticed even just a few weeks ago when the whole Russia was about to invade the Ukraine, and the representatives of the Ukraine at the UN famously declared to Russia, "There's no purgatory for war criminals. They go straight to hell." Hell is something we're very familiar with. Most of us have images of these devils with pointy heads and prongs, and they're putting people into vats of molten lava. But there's a lot of views on hell, and I want to talk about the variety of views on it, and I want to talk about how we look at it in our tradition. Hell, for whatever reason, is also great for jokes. You may have heard about the guy who went to hell only to find himself and others standing up to their knees in excrement. Well, he turned to the guy next to him and said, "This is bad, but it is not as bad as I imagined." And then the person next to him said, "Just wait." Then the demon in charge yells, "Okay, break's over. Everyone back to standing on your head." There's lots of good hell jokes. But as funny as hell can be, and with humor, a lot of people are terrified. And so they're terrified by hell because of what they've been taught in church. So if there's one goal I would love to accomplish in today's message, it would be to take away the terror, fear, and the scary part of hell. We'll see if I'm successful. I know that in this church, people love a little background. They like to know a little bit more on topics. So I try to offer some teachings outside of even religion. And you might be surprised to learn that the word hell doesn't appear in the Bible. It comes from Norse religions, and it describes an afterlife for evil souls that are tormented eternally in a concealed place, the underworld. The Bible uses variations of the Greek word of Hades, an underworld that is a place of punishment, and they also use a word, Gehenna, if I'm pronouncing it right, which describes the garbage dump outside of Jerusalem. And it was always burning, and when people had committed crimes or had committed suicide, their bodies were put there. So you can get the image there of the burning fire and the garbage. But stories about hell abound in all civilizations, it seems. Well, maybe not all, but most. One Jewish parable about hell that I really liked, it's an image, if you can picture this. It describes in hell that people who hate each other are only allowed to eat with really long spoons. Now think about that for a minute. You got a spoon this long, and you can't feed yourself. You're forced to feed others, and you're forced to have others feed you. And so hell is going in there with selfish needs and then having to rely on other people. I thought that was a really cool parable. Now, some of the earliest depictions of fiery judgment and lakes actually come from the ancient Egyptians. And the ancient Egyptians were really far ahead of almost all cultures in their deep understanding of spiritual teachings. And they taught the citizens of their kingdom that everyone would face 42 judges when they died. And the good people would go to the reed fields of heaven, and the bad people would be cast into a sulfur lake. And that's really one of the earliest examples I could find of the sort of burning, literally burning up in hell. Buddhism and Hinduism have a place in between reincarnations, and sometimes it's very hot, but other times it's ice cold. Well, how about Christianity? What do Christians think about hell? You're probably all more aware of this. Within Christianity, Roman Catholics see hell as, quote, a state of definitive self-exclusion from communion with God and the blessed. Most Protestant faiths see hell as a final punishment for those who don't accept Jesus, while Orthodox Christians focus more on the importance of the faith in the works of your life, deciding where you go. And you may be familiar with the Unitarians, and very often their full name is Unitarian Universalist. And they get the universalist part of their name in a belief that ultimately all people are reconciled out of hell. So a lot of different views. The one I found most interesting in the variety of descriptions of hell in Islam, and there are many, is Sufism. And Sufism is, the Sufis are probably the most aligned with Swedenborgian thinking. In Islam, they're very mystical. And they teach that within Islam that hell is something interior to us. It's not a place outside of us. It's something interior. So many views on hell, but the dominant one in our culture is the Christian one of eternal punishment. And it's very often used to scare people into attending church. You do know it's a mortal sin, and you can go to hell if you don't go to church. Accepting Jesus, and if you don't, you go to hell. Or just not living a good life, and then you can go to hell for that. It's kind of funny that when I do, particularly with younger people, say to me, hey, Rich, I'm not going to be able to make it this week. I really wanted to come to your service, but I can't come. And I'll say, oh, that's too bad because I'm really trying to steer you away from hell. And they often don't think I'm kidding. They're like, oh sorry, I just can't make it. So they don't even get the humor because it's such a common thing that hell is used as sort of a, well, if you don't show up, you're going to hell. So how about our tradition? We really offer a very completely different view of hell. And I preached a little while back on heaven, and a number of you said, okay, let's hear what our teachings are on hell, and here we go. Let me just start with how it's different. Well, first and foremost, in our tradition, we believe God is love. And a loving God can never punishes people. A loving God doesn't scare people. And if you remember nothing else about today's message and our view on hell, it's to remember that God casts nobody into hell. But hell does exist. In the readings today, you can see that Swedenborg is saying that these views are really contradictory of a loving God. And you may remember, some of you, a couple years ago, I did a dialogue sermon with Reverend Joseph Smith, who was a regular preacher with us. And it was on forgiveness, and I was arguing this sort of God forgives everyone, we have to forgive. And he made a really interesting point coming from his Baptist background. He said, well, actually, no. God condemns people to hell, and so doesn't forgive. I thought that was really interesting. In our tradition, God doesn't cast people into hell. In fact, Swedenborg goes as far as to say it's insane that people think God can condemn anyone, curse anyone, or throw them into hell. So he's really adamant about that. So that's a big difference. He actually says God cannot turn away from us or even look at us with a frown. God is a God of love. So these quotes give a very clear picture. A God of love condemns no one to hell. So, okay, if that's true, then why does hell exist at all? Our tradition teaches that hell exists because people want it. Through free will, we each develop different things that we love in this life, the things we love most. And there are some of us, well, all of us have a mixture, but certain people who really focus themselves on a path of controlling and dominating others, being cruel in the way they treat others. And they are choosing evil, and that actually brings evil into our world. And they choose this on earth, so when they transition out of this sphere, this planet, this life, they transition into a world that makes them most happy. And that is a place where evil exists, and it's hell. After death, they go to a community most like themselves, where they share the same passions, hatreds, and desires. So one of the hardest things for people to get their head around in our tradition is that people in hell are not necessarily unhappy, because they're engaging in what brings them the deepest joy, and that could be hatred. Okay, so then what does hell look like? Well, there's an apocalyptic view of hell in the Bible, in the book of Revelations. And it does describe that people on a second death will face a lake of fire. And so that lake of fire has really grown up in a lot of our views. Many Christians don't know that their views of hell are based on Dante's Inferno, which was a fictional book created by an author a long time ago. But this passage from Revelations is where they're basing these views of fire and hell and so forth. In our tradition, this is speaking in parables. There is not actually a fiery place with pits, and there's not eternal torment. If you think about it, only a sadist could create a place like that, not a loving God. So the symbolism of hellfire is the craving in our hearts that burns for evil. When you have that hellfire in your heart, that is what is being described as being in hell. So what does it actually look like physically if you were there? Swedenborg, who writes journals about it, says it's like kind of a burned out world with some frightening characters. But he says to them, when they see each other, they look normal to themselves. But it does say it does reek of some horrible smell, so not a pleasant place. After reading a lot of his insights, the best metaphor that I can relate to it is it's like a prison. Certain levels of evil are permitted, but there are guards that limit even the extent of evil. In hell, there are many communities as there are different desires, but it is sort of kept in check. And ultimately, evil punishes itself. Evil is its own punishment. And that's a nice thing to remember too when we see evil on this sphere being successful and acting out, and we think, wow, evil wins out. It doesn't. It eventually even punishes itself. So what do people do in hell? Well, there's some amazing stories, descriptions, but I think I'm going to share a couple views and that I thought were really telling. One was that he went into a room where there were 50 people on each side of a table, and they have bags of money, and they're counting money for eternity. And they all believe they're the most rich, and they all aspire to get the money from other people at the table. And that's their life forever. And so obviously on earth, their love was greed. In another community, people bragged that they were all emperors, dictators, and powerful leaders, each more powerful than the next, bragging about how they would come to power over the other folks that lived in that same community. So imagine a hellish community of people all constantly seeking to be number one. So these are just, there's many dialogues, and there's a short book called Dialogues with Demons that's taken condenses it into a small paperback, but it's mainly from a book called Heaven and Hell. So he describes these things, and it's pretty fascinating. But here's another big question, and this is a question that actually stresses people out. How bad do we need to be to find ourselves in hell? Well, again, according to our tradition, the good news, it's very hard to go to hell. So I hope, again, if you can take that with you today and can have some ease. It's not something that happens easily. You must really want it. You must really want to find the off-ramp to heaven. To go into hell, you must be all in. And I think it's important for us to beware of any religious leader of any faith who tries to scare or shame you with fear into believing in God. That's not how God operates. Particularly beware of leaders who say, if you don't do what I say, if you don't believe what I teach, you'll go to hell. They, I would say, are false teachers. That's not how God operates. So just beware of that. So based on all this, what kind of people are actually drawn to hell if it's so hard to get in? The people who are really drawn to hell are people who really crave domination and control over others. They're totally selfish, and they're completely led by their darkest desires. These people are furious at any criticism. They're very often drawn to leadership here on earth. It could be in gangs. We see it in a lot of religions, cults, politics, and business, places where they can gain status and power and play upon people's fears and grievances. So much of American politics right now is actually, when you look at what people are saying, the leaders, they're actually playing on our fears and our grievances. That's hellish energy. And so we all have a bit of it. We're all wrestling with the hells ourselves. And I'm sure as I'm talking, you're imagining certain people you've met or seen who have these tendencies. But we really never have any idea where anybody spends eternity because we all have completely different lives, and God knows the complexity of our life. What can we do in our own lives to steer clear of hell? One thing is to pay close attention to the motivations that you have of fear that are driving you in your life, and try to transfer that to more of a positive force in your life. And be aware there are dark forces that will speak into your daily thoughts. Be aware that when you listen to them, you're engaging the hells. Look for ways to be really honest with yourself, and look for ways that you can be of service to others. These are sure good things, things of light, that steer clear of hell. Hell is really a state of mind, and we actually begin living in heaven and hell here on earth. When we die, we transition to those communities, but we, with our decisions, kind of pick that path. So what we can do in our daily life is resist fueling hell and resist hellish energy. The more selfless and useful and kind that we become, the more we ward off hell. And the more of us that do it gives less control to hell in this world. And when we free ourselves from hellish energy, we're more able to help and free others, and then ultimately the world. So at a time when people are becoming really, in many cases, addicted to hating others they disagree with, it's important not to be drawn in by those energies, for us to be peacemakers and bridge builders. The best thing that we can do here on earth is to be peacemakers. That's fighting off hell, not just in ourselves, but in the life of this world. Amen.